In 1818, 42 years after the shot heard around the world cracked across a Massachusetts field, John Adams was asked to reflect on the meaning and impact of the American Revolution. In this brief letter, Adams explained that the American Revolution was not a common event. Its effects and consequences have already been over a great part of the globe. And when and where are they to cease? But what do we mean by the American Revolution? Do we mean the American War? The revolution was effected before the war commenced. The revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people. Revolutionary thought and thinking did not end with the Treaty of Paris, nor did it begin at Lexington and Concord. In this special podcast series, we'll explore the revolutionary ideas that were catalyzed and accelerated by the self-evident idea that all men are created equal, and what bold and new thinking that declaration is forged. Revolution at 250 is a special production of PreserveCast in partnership with Preservation Maryland and the Maryland Center for History and Culture. Our hosts are Katie Caljean, President and CEO of the Maryland Center for History and Culture, and Nicholas Redding, host of PreserveCast and President and CEO of Preservation Maryland.
Welcome to Revolution at 250, the podcast exploring the people, places, events, and ideas that shaped Maryland's remarkable role in the American Revolution. I'm Katie Caljean, here with co-host Nick Redding. As we approach the 250th anniversary of American independence, we're revisiting the stories that helped us to define our nation's founding and examine what they can still teach us today. In this episode, we're joined by researcher and historian at the Maryland State Archives, Owen Lourie, to discuss the Maryland 400 and their pivotal role in the Battle of Brooklyn in August 1776, one of the most consequential moments of the Revolutionary War. Through extensive military research, pension applications, archival collections, land records, and looking through genealogical sources, Owen has worked to identify men who served in Maryland's Revolutionary War regiments and to reconstruct their experiences both on and off the battlefield. His work has helped to shine new light on troops whose actions helped save General George Washington's army at a moment when the revolution itself hung in the balance. A frequent speaker at historical societies, heritage organizations, and commemorative events, Owen is dedicated to bringing the stories of these soldiers, their families, and their communities to modern audiences. As Maryland and the nation prepare to commemorate the Revolution's 250th anniversary, his research offers new insights into one of the defining episodes of America's struggle for independence. Owen, we're so excited to have you with us today. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you so much, Katie. I'm so glad to be here talking with you and with Nick. And thank you for such a wonderful introduction.
So for listeners who may be hearing about the story for the first time, who were the Maryland 400 and why do they hold such an important place for Maryland and American history?
The Maryland 400, the simple answer is that it's the name for a group of soldiers who, at the Battle of Brooklyn in August of 1776, find themselves holding back almost the entire British Army. And what happens is it allows so many of their colleagues, the rest of the Continental Army, to get away. The Battle of Brooklyn is the first major battle of the Revolution. It is by far the largest battle of the Revolution in terms of the number of soldiers who fight there. And for the Americans, it is a catastrophic loss. Just about everything goes wrong that could have gone wrong. And as the Americans, who have been broken badly by the British and are on the run, as they are retreating, the only thing that prevents the British from pursuing them and potentially crushing the army right there is that this group of soldiers, mostly from Maryland, some from Pennsylvania, some from Delaware, get in the way and hold them back for a while. And they take terrible casualties in doing so.
How close were we to defeat at this point?
The whole summer of 1776, the fall of 1776, the Continental Army is so close to being destroyed, essentially the entire time. At Brooklyn, they manage to get away because the Marylanders hold the line and they keep the British back. And that only buys them a little bit of time. It keeps the British occupied until the end of the day. The Americans get back to their fortified camp at the back of the battlefield, and they have a chance to pause and recover because the British don't pursue them immediately. The British don't think they need to. They get some criticism for it later. For why didn't you come in and just crush this while you could have? And they have some good reasons for not. For one thing, the American camp was pretty well fortified, and the British didn't want to just charge on it from the frontal assault. The British also didn't think they needed to hurry because they knew they still had an enormous army, which had just thoroughly defeated the Americans. And just offshore was the British fleet. And the British fleet had, in one account that I read, was the biggest fleet the British assembled between the Spanish Armada in 1588 and D-Day in 1944. I don't know if that's specifically true, but I think gives an idea of just how big the British fleet was. And the British controlled the waterways, and the Americans are stuck on what they thought of as the end of Long Island, which is now where the city of Brooklyn is. And to even get from Brooklyn back to Manhattan was going to be a challenge. And they managed to sort of slip across under the cover of darkness and under the cover of this fog which rises up in the middle of the night. 2 days after the battle, when they begin to escape back to Manhattan. And that is seen then as sort of miraculous. I think to me it feels almost like something from a movie. It is something from a movie. That's what happens at Dunkirk. The fog comes up and they manage to get everyone across without the British noticing.
Well, it seems like it's a combination of underestimation, the landscape, and the environment all feeding into this moment for escape, essentially.
Exactly. But it just leaves the Americans one step ahead of the British the whole time. The British land in Manhattan not long afterwards with so little opposition that William Smallwood, who's commanding the Maryland troops, says that he's embarrassed for the soldiers who had been on patrol when the British land. And the Americans get, over the course of the next several months, pushed around and eventually chased out of Manhattan, and they do not come back into New York City until December of 1783, the very tail end of the Revolution.
So, Owen, Nick here joining the conversation now. You put this in context, right? So you've got, officially declaring independence. Obviously, this had been underway and there had been actions prior to that. But, July of 1776. And this comes just a few weeks after that, really. I mean, like a month or so after that. You put this all in context. This is happening in rapid succession. And the army being assembled and being able to fight battles, that's also happening in rapid succession. This isn't the army of Yorktown that we will come to know that, is or even other battles where they're able to kind of go toe to toe with the British. This is not that army yet. So how extraordinary was this action of Maryland troops and the American army in this rearguard action? Like, do we remember this so well because this is perhaps like one of the few good things that comes as a result of this battle for the Americans?
Yeah, and I think there's something very American about how much we celebrate this one glorious moment in the midst of a terrible, terrible loss. I'd say that's a conversation for another day. It is a really interesting question. I think that gets to me, what's the most important thing to take away from the story of the Maryland 400, which is not, to me, necessarily that they stand there and they take on the British army to stop them from chasing after the rest of the Americans. They probably didn't know that's what they were doing. This is half of the Maryland troops. They're trying to get off the battlefield. The way that they had been trying to go is blocked. And so they just sort of wander along the road looking for a new way back to camp. And in the process, they run into about half the British army. And as they're fighting them, another large group of soldiers comes and attacks them from the side. And while all of that is going on, another group of British soldiers, the rest of them, begin coming in from the back. And In the course of this, they launch a series of charges against the British. This, to me, I think is the most important part, the thing to really take from this. Because they are able to do something that is really hard, that veteran troops later in the war will struggle to do. The veteran Maryland soldiers will struggle to do. To go from the formation of marching, so you're marching in groups or in rows, and then you need to spread yourself out all into one long line. We all have this idea of what fighting looked like during the 18th century. And to do that under fire is very hard. And they're able to do it. They charge against the British, and it takes a while to get the Americans to charge the British in general over the course of the war. And they actually push the British back a fair way before the British recover and chase the Americans back, and the Marylanders fall back into the woods. And then, under fire, they're able to reform themselves and do it again. They launch at least 2 charges. Some accounts say that there were 6 charges. Probably means that some groups fought 2 charges before they tried to get off the battlefield, and others charged more. It's a really hard thing to do, and particularly when we think about among the Marylanders, there are a total of 6 people who have any prior military experience. There are a few men who had been young officers in the French and Indian War who fought in the 1750s. There are a few people who had been in a rifle company that saw some patrol service around Boston, but probably didn't see very much fighting, if any fighting. And notably, of those 6 people, only 2 of them were on the battlefield that day. The others were either still in Maryland or they were sick. So these are all essentially completely untested soldiers. Some of the people who are leading the companies are essentially children. One of the captains who is for one of the companies who makes this charge, one of the captains is sick, and so his first lieutenant takes command, and he's 19. The Marylanders had about 6 months of training, which today we don't think of as being very much. We wouldn't send soldiers into war with 6 months of training today, but it's a lot more than a lot of other soldiers had in the Continental Army. There have been people who probably had no more than a week or 2 of time patrolling and learning how to fire their muskets.
And do you think that that's what makes up for the difference? Is that what gives them a little bit of an edge? And I just out of curiosity for the Marylanders who are listening, who might be kind of specific to this stuff, do we know where they were trained? Where did that all take place? So
we know fairly well about where they were before they deployed. The Marylanders they enlisted people in the winter of 1776, and then starting around March and April, they began to move all the men half into Annapolis and then half into Baltimore. And they spent that time until early July drilling. And probably the main thing that they did was learn how to walk together, to march together, to maneuver as a group. Because when you're dealing with, a company is 75 men, more or less. And that's just one of 8 or 9 companies that the Marylanders have. And you need to be able to move everyone together without people running into each other or turning the wrong way. And that's hard to do. The companies had been raised geographically, so that there's a company that's raised mostly in Western Maryland, and there's a company that's raised primarily in Charles County, things like that. And that may play into the reason that they perform so well during the battle. And part of it is their training, but their training is only going to take them so far, because nothing that you would have learned in training could have prepared you for what they were running into. And I think that's true of any group of soldiers. But knowing each other is, I think, really critical. What we know about fighting during the Revolutionary War, and during the 18th century in general, is that retreat is just a fact of life. Every unit at some point is going to have to run off the battlefield. The Marylanders do it over the course of the war. Everyone does. And for soldiers, the mindset is essentially, you don't want to be the last one there. If you think the guys next to you are going to retreat, you are going to be a little bit more. If you think you're going to be the last one who's going to retreat, no, don't try saying that again. Believing in the soldiers next to you is really critical, because if you think that they're going to retreat first, you don't want to be left behind when they go. So you're going to try to get off the battlefield ahead of them. at the same time, if you trust the people who you are standing next to, if you believe that they'll stand and fight, you're more likely to stand and fight. Mm-hmm. And I think the fact that a lot of these people knew each other and they talk about it, some of their correspondence and their pension applications later, it's clear that they enlist with guys who they knew, people who they grow up with family members, and that breeds a certain amount of trust, which I think really, really helps them. The other thing we know that inspires men to stay on the battlefield is that officers will sometimes talk to them, try to motivate them. And some of it is, we know that you're brave men who will stand here and do your duty. But I think that will only take you so far. The other things that they would tell them is, we also know that you're going to stand here, you're going to represent your state, you're going to represent your town. And if you fight bravely today, people back home are going to know. At the same time, if you don't fight bravely today, people back home are going to know.
So it's so interesting, like thinking about like these personal narratives and the correspondence or the application records. And so in your process of looking to these primary sources for more information on the human element of battle, which oftentimes we think about it as a very sterile, impenetrable part of the past, was there anything that was surprising to you, maybe that challenged your assumption of the story you thought you knew of the Maryland 400 versus what revealed itself in those personal accounts?
Yeah, everything with the Revolutionary War has so much myth built up around it. There's the idea that everyone who fought in the Continental Army was, depending on who you ask, heroic independent farmers there fighting for American liberty. Or, on the other hand, they were there, the dregs of society, who joined the Army because there was no one else who would hire them. And with the Maryland 400 in particular, there's so many myths about how they knew that they were standing up and making a suicide charge because they wanted to save their colleagues. And we don't really think that's true. I don't think it detracts from their actions and from their heroism. And that they didn't necessarily intend to hold the British back to cover the American retreat. One of the things that we found a lot of things in the course of this research that surprised us. One was who was in the Army. We know that there are plenty of people from the upper class, from the gentry, who are in the Army, because to the extent that the Maryland 400 are remembered at all, it's that handful of individuals who go on to be prominent in society. There are 3 future governors who are at the Battle of Brooklyn. There are senators and congressmen, members, high-ranking state officials, Samuel Smith, who's in Congress for 40 years, from Baltimore. He's a young captain at the Battle of Brooklyn. So we knew that there were plenty of rich folks, but we really weren't sure who the rest of them were, and we weren't really sure how much we would be able to figure out about who the rest of them were. Not everyone leaves a long paper trail, the way history works. And that's especially true of people who are not well off or just of people who are young. If you're only 18, 20, 25, you may not have done very much that interacts with the government yet. And so there aren't going to be that kind of record that follows you along. There's still plenty of things that we don't know about who these men were. We can't even identify all of them. But we learned quite a bit. We know that it's actually a pretty economically and ethnically diverse group of people. That there are rich guys, but there are also small farmers. There are people whose family own 100 or maybe 200 acres of land. There are people who are tenant farmers who have just renting land from somebody else. There are skilled artisans. They have some trouble keeping the skilled artisans in the Army after 1776. And there are definitely, what we think of as just common laborers, unskilled folks as well. And they're mixed together in the Army in a way that I don't think people expect.
And Owen, this whole special series has sort of been about how the revolution continued to inspire after 1783. And in some cases, we go back to the revolution to look at different topics. And that's one of these. We're really kind of on the nose here about the revolution and this Revolutionary Army very early on. it occurs to me that what you just described about economically diverse. Now, we haven't talked about racially or anything like that yet, but economically diverse regiment and makeup of the regiment is in itself kind of revolutionary, because the European armies didn't look so much like that. You had a gentry class, and then you had people who were, this is my understanding, people who were not economically very successful serving in the ranks, right? Like, this was a way they would go in and the recruitment parties and things like that in Europe. Is that right? Is this a sort of a different looking army than perhaps what they were facing with the British?
I think that's exactly right. Many of the British soldiers who were there were professionals who had been in the army for a long time. There were certainly new recruits in the British Army, but I think they were definitely coming in with a different mindset. The real difference is in the officer class, that the British officers were all from the aristocracy, to the point where you had to pay to get an officer's commission. You had to pay a significant amount of money. And in the Continental Army in general, and in the Maryland troops, the gentry does tend to be the officers, and the officers tend to be wealthy, but not nearly to the same extent that you see among the British. And the other thing, and this surprised me quite a bit, was that after 1776, there is a need for experienced men to be officers. And there aren't that many experienced soldiers in Maryland. And so when Maryland has to raise 6 more regiments of soldiers for the Continental Army, instead of just having one regiment, they need men who've been in battle before. And so they pick people who were not of the gentry, and they become officers. So people who were experienced sergeants or corporals, or there are even a handful of people who were privates, who were maybe from the middle class or from the working class, as we would think of them today, are able to become officers just based on merit. And that's something that would not have happened, I think, in any other army in the world at that time.
Yeah, that in and of itself is sort of a revolutionary statement about what this nation would be, and how this sort of meritocracy developing within American arms. Speaking of sort of, we're setting the stage for what happened and who these people were, how they were different, how this was somewhat revolutionary. There's a lot of mythology, of course, that's developed around something like this, particularly, and maybe particular to Maryland. Like, it has taken on a life of its own. In theory, the nickname of the state is associated with this event, the Old Line State. Let's start there, and then we can kind of move out a little bit, give Katie some ground to ask about some of these questions too. Because, obviously we don't know all the answers, and you've pointed out we will never know every single one of these people. We'll never know exactly what happened because none of us were there. But did Washington refer to the Maryland troops as his old line, and is that why we're called that? And where do you fall on that whole thing? Because I think that's where a lot of people start with this story.
Sure, and just as by way of explanation, the idea of Maryland being an old line comes from the idea that each state's troops would be collectively referred to as their lines. You could have the Maryland line and the Delaware line and the Pennsylvania line. So the idea that Maryland's troops were an old line is saying that they fought like veteran soldiers, that they fought like old soldiers rather than young, fresh recruits, which is what they really were.
Okay, that's helpful context too. I'm not sure everybody knows that piece.
Yeah, absolutely. As far as we know, Washington doesn't say it about the Marylanders after the Battle of Brooklyn or about the Marylanders at any other time, as far as we know.
I'm sorry, Owen. You've just broken my heart. I'm going to need a moment.
I break some hearts sometimes. What I'll tell you, though, is that he may not have said it, but he believed it, and he meant it.
Well, now, how do you know that?
Washington had tremendous respect for the Maryland soldiers.
Okay.
We know that there are people who notice, and people close to Washington during the Battle of Brooklyn even, who notice how well the Marylanders are fighting. So famous Marylander Tench Tillman, who's one of Washington's aides, he writes a letter talking about how they noticed that the Marylanders fought better than everybody else did.
Okay.
I think the real compliment that we see Washington paid to the Maryland soldiers comes later in the war, comes in 1780, where the American army that had been in the South is captured and surrenders at Charleston in the spring of 1780. And the Americans need someone to go face the British who are down in the Carolinas, where the British are thinking that they're going to run wild and they're going to be able to retake all of this territory. And Washington needs new soldiers to send, and he sends the soldiers from Maryland. He sends, and from Delaware. I always point out that whenever we talk about the Marylanders fighting, the men from Delaware are always there with them for pretty much the whole war.
Well, we don't have to do that in this podcast, but yes, that's fine.
I know too many folks who study the Delaware soldiers. But to me, that's the real compliment, is that lots of states will talk about how their soldiers were the best regarded in the war. And I assume that's when we talk about Maryland, I assume that's everyone was saying that Maryland soldiers were so good because we're from Maryland, right? But when Washington needs an army, and he doesn't send the rest of the Continental Army, he doesn't send people from other states, he sends the army from Maryland.
So let me ask, just before I pass the torch over to Katie for a second, then where does the mythology around him saying, I mean, there's quotes around this, and the name of the state is this. Where does that actual phrase come from? Do we know? And it sounds like we need to update the archives page, because there's a page that in excruciating detail says he says this.
That's possible. I know that we have done some research talking about how he probably doesn't really say it. So one of my colleagues did some years ago.
But that's so interesting too, right? Like back to the mythology of like the story that we tell ourselves about ourselves, and when that story started, right? Like going back to when we felt that we needed to craft the story about our own, perception of our history. And so, history is something that is constantly being reinterpreted based on the new evidence that we find. And your decade-long journey to better understand the story, or more, I feel like it's at least a decade, right, Owen?
13 years.
13 years to be precise, 13-year journey to better understand this part of our state's heritage. I'm curious, when you started that journey, what was the question you were seeking to unravel? Like, what was your entry point?
Yeah, that first summer, this was a project that we started in conjunction with Major General James Adkins, who was the Adjutant General of Maryland at the time. And the National Guard in Maryland traces their heritage back to this group of soldiers. Mm-hmm. We think about the volunteer soldiers raised in Maryland. The first group was these men who enlisted in early 1776. And so to the National Guard, this is a really special and really important group of people. And so that first question that we had was, who were they? Can we figure out all of their names? And then we were able to figure out who most of them were. We think that there were about 1,000 soldiers from Maryland at the Battle of Brooklyn.
So not 400.
There were not 400. We'll come back to that in a moment. So we think that there were about 1,000. We can identify 868 of them. And from
B plus.
Yeah, it's pretty good. It's pretty good. I keep wondering where we're going to find the rest of them. Uh-huh. I'm sure they're out there somewhere. There are a couple of companies whose muster rolls have disappeared. That's where most of the gaps are from. And from there, it just became, can we figure out who they were? Not just their names, not just being able to count them on a list of troop strength. Is what can we find out about their lives? For some of them, we were able to come up with only that they enlisted in 1776, or just the basic outlines of their military service. Mm-hmm. But we were really fortunate that there were a number of them, and both ordinary soldiers and officers, who we were able to piece together fairly thorough depictions of their life, and to learn what they did after the war, what they did during the war, in ways that really humanize a lot of them. And to me, that's when I look back on all of this work that me and my team of interns and all of the people who have helped on this, all of this work that we've done, the thing that really strikes me is a lot of these are soldiers. These are people who may not have been thought about in 150 years or 200 years. And that we're the first people who are looking at their lives, or the first people who are talking about them again. And that really struck me. That had some emotional weight. as we were working on it, because I think it gave us it gave us a new goal. I would say, almost say, even more than just writing their biographies, but it gives you the responsibility that you're bearing witness to their life and to what their world was and to what they did in it.
Yeah, and there's also sort of this sense in these major battles and conflicts that if you're involved in them, you're somehow, there's this legacy, there's this immortality that is bestowed upon you as a part of that. And the reality is that falls by the wayside pretty quick. But you have in some ways sort of like resurrected these stories and these people and have brought them back out. And you have this forthcoming book. And I mean, this is all very exciting. I'm curious, like little anecdotes, snapshots, stories of people that have just really resonated with you. Are there a handful that just like stick with you that are kind of like your pals that you would just love to meet, or you have more questions for them, or just sort of, those sorts of oddballs of history that you just are like, this is a story everybody should know about?
Yeah. Well, in the experiences that we have, especially when you look after the war, the experiences really run the gamut. So, we talked about there are plenty of people in this group who go on to become famous and, nationally significant people, or people who shape the course of Maryland history or things like that. Samuel Smith comes up with the plan that saves Baltimore from being captured by the British in 1814, right? He's in Congress for 40 years. And then there are people whose lives really exemplify these trends in American history. So there are people who, both rich and poor, find themselves just crushed by when the economy collapses in the 1780s. There are some folks who, in their time, had been really prominent. Someone like Francis Ware, who's the lieutenant colonel in 1776. So he's the second in command. And he was an important person. He was a big deal. He had been instrumental in helping to organize Charles County prior to the outbreak of hostilities. So he's part of the early revolutionary movement. He's politically important. And he is a name who, if you talk to so many people in Maryland, no one will know who he is. And what happens to him is that he is after the war, he's the sheriff of Charles County. And to be sheriff, you had to put up a fairly sizable bond amount of money to say that you're going to do your job. And if you didn't, you'd have to repay the state. The sheriff's job was to collect taxes. Unfortunately, most of the people in the county couldn't pay their taxes because they were struggling because the economy is terrible. Nobody's being paid, has actual money. People are bartering. They're using IOUs. Even the soldiers haven't been paid in actual money. And so Ware can't collect the taxes, which means that he has to put up the money himself, which he can't do. So he goes into debt. And also, because he can't do his job, his performance bond gets pulled. And the people who put up money to help him have to pay the money, but they can't pay it either. And so this entire network of debt and the economy, it just falls apart. And Francis Ware ends up, the legislature votes him a small pension. I'm sure he doesn't while away his days in a hut in poverty, but someone who had been really prominent, really important, he just sort of falls away. And we have people who move out west, who go looking for land because it's hard to find land. Even middle-class people in Maryland in the decades before and after the Revolution have trouble buying land for themselves.
We've always had a housing affordability issue here, Owen.
Exactly. Well, and if you're a second or a third or a fourth child, no one's leaving you any land because you can't subdivide 100 acres into 6 or 8 pieces and still make any money from it. And so folks there's land available to veterans. There's federal bounty land. So there's people end up in Pennsylvania and Ohio and Kentucky. And some of them we know are able to use their bounty land and also their veterans pensions that Congress votes in the 18-teens and the 1820s to build themselves new lives. I think some of the most prominent story is of William and Samuel McMillan. And these two brothers, they are from Harford County. They are corporals and sergeants. One's a corporal and one's a sergeant at the Battle of Brooklyn. Both of them are captured. Their story during the war is remarkable in itself. which is that they are captured. The British take them to Nova Scotia. Possibly they are being impressed into a British Army unit. In the spring of 1777, they escape, and they travel by foot from Nova Scotia, from Halifax, all the way to northern Maine, where they're able to get transport by boat back to Boston, where they re-enlist. And Samuel serves until 1781, when his enlistment expires, and William stays in the army until 1783, becoming, according to him, a lieutenant. And that's a remarkable story in and of itself. And William has a letter where he describes this in great detail. After the war, they both travel out together at some point, and they find themselves in northwestern Pennsylvania, so up near Erie, up along the lake. And they go into business together. We're not exactly sure what kind of business they're in, but they're doing well enough that when they finally go bankrupt, probably because of the Panic of 1819, the national economy collapses, they're doing well enough that they owe thousands of dollars. So they're not doing small amounts of business. They're doing big business. They own land. William becomes a member of the county government. And these are two kids who are just immigrants from Scotland. They may not have been indentured servants when they came, but they're certainly not in the upper classes. And they use their position both from the war and the benefits that they get afterwards to build themselves new lives. And they prosper really well.
So I'm curious about the correspondence, right? Like, it's always interesting to read what people perceive about themselves and what they choose to write about and what is left out of the story, or what picture they're painting. So in your research, what sorts of letters, diaries, what kind of materials have you dug into?
Sometimes I'm frustrated by how little we have that are firsthand accounts, and sometimes I'm amazed by how much we have. Which I think is true of anybody who studies this time period. In general, the people from Maryland spend less time writing letters or writing in journals than the people in New England do. That may be why when we have so many accounts of what the war, people like to use, we get stories from New Englanders because they wrote a lot more than people from Maryland did. They're probably higher adult literacy rates. But there are accounts of the battle, which are written in the days afterwards. There are a handful from Maryland soldiers, which are published in newspapers, which was fairly common at the time, and those come out right afterwards. And we can tell that they're from Marylanders. Some of them we can identify the writer, some of them we can't, and those are invaluable in describing what happens at the battle. On their own, though, they're a little hard to work with because, like so many times when you have eyewitness accounts, they don't always tell the same story. And so we have to rely on a few other accounts that can help fill in some of the gaps. One of the things there are also then, to go along with those, with the immediate accounts, is there are a few people who write accounts of the battle many years later. So William McMillan writes a letter to somebody in Washington who he hopes is going to help him push his pension along, because he's trying to get service as a lieutenant, which there's really no records of him being. And because there's not a lot of paperwork with these pensions, people would go in and they would basically tell a story of their time in the Army. And often it would just be basic details, but sometimes they would get into great depth. And that's what McMillan does. And he says some things about the battle that we don't hear from other folks. And then Samuel Smith, sometime after the war, he sits down and he writes a memoir about his time in the Army, in the third person, of course, which is then saved by his son. His son publishes it, and all that material ends up at the Maryland Historical Society, I believe. The Maryland Center for History and Culture. And those help because while there are some places where you can't tell exactly what's happening when, they're telling enough of them are telling about similar anecdotes. So we know that during the battle, at some point they're walking along the road trying to get back to their fortified camp. And you have to remember, you can't see anywhere because by this point, there are 25,000 people have been firing muskets for a couple of hours. So you probably can't see 10, 20, 30 yards in front of you. And so they tell these stories about how they would be wandering along and suddenly they'd run into a group of British soldiers, or you get to a spot where the smoke clears. And so they tell a story about how a group of British soldiers pretends to surrender. And then when they get close to try to capture them, the officer yells fire and he shoots them. He claps his hands. So we have those kinds of accounts of the battle. Those are fantastic. In terms of accounts from individual soldiers talking about the rest of their time in the Army, it really does come from their federal pension applications, which are just a phenomenal resource. They have some drawbacks. One is that this is a pension program that was started in 1818. And so these are people who are remembering things, 50 years later. And sometimes they'll say, I know I did some of these things in the Army, but I can't really remember where we were or what was happening. And there's people who are 60, 70, 80 years old. If you've lived that long, and the other downside is that sometimes their exact words weren't being recorded by the person who's writing it. And so the statement will just say, and he fought at this battle and this battle, and his officers were these people. And he didn't, that's not what the actual person himself said. But sometimes you'll get great detail. There's a Sergeant Thomas McKeel, who's from the Eastern Shore. He writes that after he was captured at the Battle of Brooklyn, he was held on board of prison ships until the British were able to fully capture Manhattan in November, at which point all the men were brought off the prison ships and into makeshift prisons in the city. So they used warehouses and churches and things like that. And that they kept him there until he was released in a prisoner exchange around the end of 76, beginning of 1777. So those kinds of accounts give, I think, they give us more information sometimes, but they also give us that personal view to what's happening. It's one thing for us to know we have records that say there were prisoner exchanges at the end of the year.
Right. Like different sources are recorded for different purposes, right? Like whoever is doing the recording, whether it be the individual or a third party, like the reason that is being recorded is not for us as historians. It is for the function of whatever that moment is. And so it's just so interesting to me to think about like where information is and corroborating the story, but also what persists and what continues to survive. Like thinking about who thought it was important to save this material and thinking about not only federal records or state records, but like private repositories or other organizations like ours at the Maryland Center for History and Culture, thinking about what people chose to collect and what was important for people to save. Like it's always, a surprise, but also, I wish we had something on X. So there's still a question that you're seeking to answer that like you have not yet been able to find a source for other than the other 100 and however many other names.
Well, so that's part of it. So there's one big question.
What's the big question?
We don't know what happens to most of the soldiers at the Battle of Brooklyn. We know that Maryland loses 256 men either killed or captured at the battle. There are a couple of people who say that. And there's even a strength return, so a chart drawn up of how many men were lost by rank and by each company. So we know those kind of numbers. But again, we don't know how many of them were killed and how many of them were captured. We can identify 4 people who are killed and about 70 who are captured. And the rest of them, we just don't know. And that's in part because at the time, not a lot of care was paid to the fate of individual soldiers. And in fact, William Smallwood, the Marylanders commander, when he writes back giving Maryland government an update about what's happened, he complains that the British won't tell him who the private soldiers are, who they've captured. That they know who the officers are, but they don't know who the privates are. But, the Marylanders figured it out, that sometime after the battle, they went through and they made a listing of who the soldiers were who had been lost because they needed to consolidate some of the units. Some of the companies lost so many men at the battle that they couldn't function on their own anymore. And so people were shuffled around, or new companies were sort of composite companies were formed. And we know that they had this document. And that's the one we need that would tell us the names of everyone who is lost, tell us the names of everyone who was at the battle, and tell us what happens to them, what their fate was. And that's missing. We don't know exactly what happened to it. But when you talk about records that were created for a purpose and how you can sometimes learn things from different records, learn things that weren't the reason the record was created, we know this list exists because in the 1850s, the person who was in charge of the Maryland Land Office writes a letter in support of the soldier's pension. The Maryland Land Office had oversight over all the state's Revolutionary War service records. There was not a state archives at the time. There wasn't going to be a state archives for another 100 years or so. And he writes a letter and he says, I have seen this list and it describes the arrangement of the soldiers and this soldier's service. We can document it because of this list. And I know it was there because I took great care in organizing and in studying the state's Revolutionary records. Great. So we go looking for it. We can't find it. It does not seem to be in the holdings of the Maryland State Archives. We don't know exactly what happened to it, but we can come up with some guesses. And one is that there are some periods of where documents go missing from the state's holdings. That period before there's a state archives. One of the people who oversees the land office later in the 19th century is a famous document collector. And he is notorious for having sold and given his letters that came from state custody to some of his buddies and his other collectors. And we can say that there is that the listing that gives us the numbers of soldiers lost at the battle. That's at the New York Public Library, even though it was written by William Smallwood and sent back to Maryland government. That's at the New York Public Library because it was in the collection of a document collector who eventually donated his material to the NYPL.
So anybody out there that has heard a lead on where this documentation might be, this is the year. This is the moment.
And I guess, Owen, it's also possible, and not to besmirch the Maryland State Archives, but could it not be misfiled too? Couldn't it just be stuck somewhere that you just haven't looked yet? It's
entirely possible. So we've actually spent a lot of work working with some outside organizations, including the Society of the Cincinnati of Maryland, to digitize a huge amount of our Revolutionary era correspondence, in the course of which we have found some new things in our holdings that we hadn't looked at before. There are some collections held both by us and at the Maryland Center for History and Culture that had been in the possession of John Thomas Scharf, who's the document hoarder. And that's a collection that is so big and so varied that it's hard to know what's in there in both halves of the collection.
So I would also say, not only if somebody has it and is listening, but if someone would like to pay the Maryland Center for History and Culture and the Maryland State Archives to digitize all of that, I'm sure you guys would be willing to entertain that.
More than happy. We've been on a similar road with Society of Cincinnati to digitize as much of our Revolutionary War holdings as possible, but it's a massive collection and it's going to take years to do, but it's something that needs to be made accessible and useful for public audiences.
So let me ask this, Owen. And we've spent a good amount of time kind of digging into the story, which is just so fascinating, and there's so many layers of history here. But and I didn't think we would get to a nefarious document collector, but there we were. It also seems like it's a double-edged sword, having all of these different versions of history and all these different accounts. Is that what accounts for all the mythology around this? I mean, we started with the Maryland 400, and I'm still curious about where that phrase, the old line state, actually comes from. But then you've got that there's 400 of them. That we've debunked that, but where did that number come from? And we still use it. And I understand that there's a burial pit somewhere in Brooklyn. I'd like you to tell us where that is, if you could. And, all of these sorts of myth making around this, is that the result of sort of the varied nature of the accounts themselves?
No, most of those myths I mostly blame the Victorians for.
Ah, okay.
And, I know they're not here to defend themselves. But that's when we start to see a lot of these really just sort of like either rose-colored views of what happens, overly romanticized, or some of these myths about, they were called the 400, or there's a graves of them all somewhere. Some of them we can actually trace to where they come from. Come from histories of New York, written in the 1860s and the 1870s. And I think a lot of that comes from, at that point, there are not quite 100 years out from when the battle occurred. And I think it means you're right at the edge of what living people could actually remember. Mm-hmm. And it's just in that perfect sweet spot for there to be some truth. And then also some of the details get kind of mixed up, and some of the edges get sanded down a little bit, and you lose track of some of those actual facts. So yes, it is often told that there is a gravesite for the Marylanders. For many years, it was said to be in a vacant lot in downtown Brooklyn, sort of, right in the heart of some very expensive real estate. For many years, the person who owned the lot wouldn't allow any archaeology, supposedly because he was afraid that they would find something, at which point he wouldn't be able to do anything with this land. About 10 years ago, the city of New York purchased it and built a school there. And when the city purchases something where there is potential for historical significance, the city has to do archaeology. And they found absolutely nothing. Mm-hmm. They found shockingly little given how much urban development there has been in New York City and in Brooklyn. But, that was always going to be the case. And those of us who have been studying the battle itself could have told you that, because when we talk about there being a gravesite of the Marylanders, we say, who put them there, right? It's not the British. The British don't care. There are some third-hand accounts or second-hand accounts of mass graves being dug and some of the Americans being dumped in them. That's probably true, even though we don't have real eyewitnesses. But we have eyewitnesses who talk about, a couple people who talk about how mostly what the British do is they leave the bodies in the fields. Because, first of all, they don't really care that much. And because, second, it's a nice reminder to anyone else who thinks that fighting against the king is a good idea. You'll end up dead in a field, and we're not even going to bury your remains. And we know that the Marylanders died all across the battlefield as they fought their way to try to get to safety. And if any of them were buried, it was very haphazardly done. That was just, I think, a matter of how 18th century battlefields were treated.
And what about the 400? Why does that persist? Is that just somebody picked a number at one point?
So I can give you three theories.
Okay.
Of which I think they are probably all correct. Which is, when you do this kind of history, you have to be very comfortable with a certain amount of ambiguity. And I think that the name Maryland 400 covers that very well. The simplest explanation is that of that 1,000 Maryland soldiers who are at the battle, we know only about half of them are able to get off the battlefield, and the other half take part in this famous last stand. And if you do the math in a certain way and you think about it, that you could come up with about 400 soldiers being there, kind of. I think that there are some other factors that go into that being the name. I think part of it is it's a reference to the Spartan 300, people in the movie who hold back the Persians at the Battle of Thermopylae. And Maryland 400 is a name that we first see in the 1880s and the 1890s, which is a period where there's a lot of awareness of Greek history and Greek myth. And the other thing that goes into the name is that right at the same time we see Maryland 400 first used, is there is a listing published in New York City of the 400, who are the families who matter in Gilded Age high society. So the who's who, the richest, the most fashionable people in New York City. They're called the 400. And there are references of people in the 1890s and the early 1900s who make that comparison. So in New York, they have their 400. But in Maryland, we have our 400 who saved the American Army to give their 400 the freedom to be here still.
So it was a marketing ploy.
That's one way. I mean, I tend to think of it as a
rebranding.
Yeah, having a good name is always very helpful.
And speaking of the good name, back to where we started with the mythology, Old Line State. I mean, we know now it means older, sort of experienced troops. A line is the troops, but it doesn't sound like it really was Washington. Who was it, and when was it?
My understanding is that it shows up in either the early 19th century or the late 18th century, so around the 1790s or early 1800s, early enough that people know what was meant by line. That both the people who start using it, that they know what an old line would the significance of what that would have been.
Well, and then you have the old stone house as part of the story too. Like it obviously wasn't always the old stone house. Like at some point, that adjective was added to the description. So what part does the Old Stone House play in this story?
So the site that is now known as the Old Stone House, which is in Brooklyn, which is near the site where the Marylanders made their stand. And it is the museum that interprets the Battle of Brooklyn, and particularly the stand of the Marylanders. It, at the time, would have been called the Veitch Cortelu House, after the names of the families who had built it. The house was eventually was torn down at some point, but was rebuilt, I believe, in the 1930s as a WPA project. And I assume that's when it got the name of the Old Stone House, because, hey, it's that Old Stone House over there.
And so as we kind of move towards a conclusion here, tell us a little bit about the book that people can expect to pick up a copy of, and what are they going to learn from this book that is 13 odd years in the making, or really almost 250 years in the making in some respects. What's it called? When is it going to be available? And what's the central thesis of it?
So the book is called Finding the Maryland 400, which I think tells you a little bit about what the book is about figuring out who they were and what their lives were like. So the first portion of the book looks at the soldiers from Maryland who fight in 1776, looking at them sort of collectively, giving an overview, who they were, how old they were, what their motivations were, things like that. So it's that sort of bigger picture thing. But we're able to use some very specific examples from individuals because we've done so much biographical research. Mm-hmm. And then we also follow the regiment essentially day by day or week by week through that first year of the war in 1776, which is just a horrible time for them because they see defeat after defeat after defeat until by the point where they finally get to some victories at the end of the year. Most of the people from Maryland are sick or they're wounded and they're not there. Very few people take part at the battles of Trenton and Princeton. So that's the first half of the book. And then the second half is really where the real heart of it is we have biographies of all of the soldiers we could identify with as much detail about their lives as we could come up with. And the idea of what we're doing is first to sort of very specifically, here's who these soldiers were who fought at Brooklyn and who fought in 1776. You know, what motivated people in 76? What happens to them? But in doing so, I think what we're really doing is we're telling the story of all of Maryland's soldiers, that it amounts to a group portrait, essentially, to really describe what they were and what happened to them. And one of the goals with this was to produce a book that was accessible to the general public, but makes use of not only all of this new research that we have done, but that incorporates so much of the scholarly research that has happened over the last, say, 50 years, and sort of unite it all into a place, because you can't expect everybody to spend their time reading arcane military history articles. And so many people, when you start telling them about battles and generals and arrows on a map, their eyes just glaze over. And so we're trying to make this to be something that anyone can read, and anyone can learn who these people were, because I think it's important that we tell this story as widely as we can. but that we make use of as much information as we could.
And I think it's really important that it's people focused. I think that will make it more accessible to a more general audience. But I think also the fact that you've been so forthright about your research process, like the process of doing history and working with primary sources to question the past, and knowing that that's an okay thing to do, to challenge our assumptions and to make ourselves more aware of what happened based on those accounts. And I think the fact that you're bundling it all together, like, uplifting all the new research and pointing to the sources and bibliography, I think having that one-stop shop, I think, is going to be such a huge resource for the field. So thank you for doing it.
Well, thank you for so many kind words about what we're doing. And definitely a thought that has been in my mind as we were working on this, which is that so many of the sources that I was making use of were work that was done at the bicentennial.
Right.
And we're still using those. And so there was one of the things that was driving me as I went through the editing and the fact checking was, if someone's using this in 50 years, I want something that is helping them and not something that they complain about. It's like, God, the only source we have is this book and it's it's just terrible. So I thought that was really important to trying to create something lasting.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what a perfect time to do it. We'll make sure that the links on how to get a copy of this are in the show notes. And, looking at the Revolutionary War through the lens that we've been doing in this little special series, you couldn't ask for a more on-the-point topic for Maryland than this regiment and these troops. And not only that, but the revolutionary makeup of this regiment and how they were the beginning of something very different in terms of a military makeup and a military of meritocracy. And all those stories are in this book. And we can't thank you enough for joining us and for all the effort you put into it. Thank you so much, Owen.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was really nice to have a chance to talk about this and to help tell the story of the Marylanders, which is really what we're trying to do. So I really, really appreciate that. The book will be officially released in August, time to the 250th anniversary of the Battle of the Brooklyn. And I cannot wait to get a copy into my hand and to get a copy into other people who've been looking for this as well.
Us too. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to PreserveCast. To dig deeper into this episode's story, head over to preservecast.org for show notes and our collection of previous episodes. Don't forget to engage with this podcast by subscribing, commenting, and leaving a review. Follow along on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at PreserveCast for even more. PreserveCast is currently recorded in Walkersville, Maryland, and sponsored by the 1772 Foundation, and powered by Preservation Maryland. Thanks for listening, and keep on preserving.